Everyone has seen a Soviet tank. You've seen the photos, the long barrel, the low silhouette, the red star painted on the turret. Maybe you've seen them rolling through newsreel footage or sitting frozen in a museum somewhere with a placard explaining what model it was and what battle it survived. You think you know what you're looking at. But here's the thing, you probably don't, because painted on the side of nearly every Soviet tank that fought from 1941 onward, there were numbers. Big, bold, clearly visible numbers, and almost none of them meant what you think they meant. They didn't come from a central registry. They weren't assigned by a bureaucrat in Moscow. They weren't standardized across divisions or even across regiments. In some cases, they weren't assigned by officers at all, and yet they were there, on thousands of vehicles, painted in white or red or yellow, often in styles that shifted from unit to unit, from front to front, and sometimes from battle to battle. What you're about to find out is what those numbers actually were. Not what the official version says, not what the post-war documentation claims, but what was actually happening on the ground, inside the units, in the workshops, and sometimes in the minds of individual crew members who painted whatever they felt made sense and drove into combat the next morning. This is not a simple story. There's no clean answer, because the Soviet military was not a clean machine. It was enormous, chaotic, underfunded in some areas, obsessively secretive in others, and held together by a culture that blended iron discipline with improvisation so extreme it would make a NATO logistics officer faint. If you want to understand why Soviet tank crews painted numbers that didn't match any official registry, you have to understand the system they were operating in, or more accurately, the absence of one. And once you do, you'll never look at a Soviet tank photo the same way again. Before we get into it, if you find yourself getting pulled into stories like this, the kind that crack open a door into how wars were actually fought, not just what the history books say, make sure you hit subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from, and we go deep every single time. Let's start with what the numbers were supposed to be. In theory, Soviet armored units used a tactical numbering system. The idea was simple. You paint a number on a tank so that commanders can identify specific vehicles on the battlefield. You can radio instructions to a specific vehicle, you can track losses, you can coordinate movements in the chaos of combat. In theory, this made perfect sense. Every modern military had some version of this. The Germans had their turret numbers, the Americans had their bumper codes, the British had their formation signs and vehicle serials. These systems weren't glamorous, but they served a function, and in well-organized militaries they were maintained with reasonable consistency. The Soviet system, at least on paper, worked on a similar principle. Higher numbers in a formation hierarchy were assigned to higher-ranking vehicles. A battalion commander's tank might have a certain prefix. Company commanders would have numbers in a certain range. Individual platoon vehicles would be numbered sequentially within those ranges. Some documents show a 3-digit system where the first digit indicates the company, the second indicates the platoon, and the third indicates the vehicle's position within that platoon. So a tank numbered 112 would theoretically be the second vehicle of the first platoon of the first company. Clean, logical, easy to follow on a map, except almost nobody actually followed it that way consistently. Not in 1941, not in 1942, not in many parts of the front in 1943. And even in 1944 and 1945, when the Red Army was far better organized than it had been in the catastrophic opening years, there were still units painting numbers that followed no official scheme at all. So why? The first answer, and the one that explains a huge amount of what happened in the early war, is simple and brutal. The Red Army in 1941 was falling apart. Operation Barbarossa hit the Soviet military with a force and speed that the Soviet command structure simply could not absorb. In the first weeks of the war, entire armies were encircled. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were captured or killed. Divisions ceased to exist as coherent fighting units, and among the losses were not just men, but records. Regimental records, vehicle logs, assignment documents, maintenance records, tactical numbering lists, all of it, gone. Burned in retreats, left behind in the chaos. Lost in the destruction of headquarters units that were overrun before anyone could evacuate the paperwork. When new units were formed from survivors and fresh conscripts, and whatever equipment could be scraped together from factories and repair shops, they often had no connection to the records of whatever units they were nominally replacing. A fresh tank brigade might inherit the official designation of a brigade that had been completely destroyed, but it wouldn't have any of that brigade's documentation, its equipment history, its vehicle registry, nothing. So when the new crews painted numbers on their tanks, they were starting from scratch. And starting from scratch in the Red Army of 1941 and 1942 meant making do. The second answer has to do with how tanks were actually distributed and repaired. In the Western conception of armored warfare, a tank is assigned to a unit and stays with that unit. It gets a number. That number follows it. When it breaks down, it gets repaired and goes back to the same unit with the same number. The history of that vehicle is documented, traceable, connected. In the Soviet system, particularly in the first half of the war, this model simply did not hold. Tanks were often delivered directly from factories to frontline units with no intermediate processing. Sometimes they arrived with no tactical markings at all, just factory paint and a serial number stamped somewhere on the hull. Crews would paint whatever numbers they needed to paint in whatever time they had before they were pushed forward. Repair and recovery operations were another major factor. Destroyed or damaged tanks that could be recovered were often brought back to field repair workshops, or further back to factory facilities for restoration. When they came out the other side, they might be assigned to a completely different unit than the one they'd served with before. Their old number was gone, either painted over or burned off, or simply irrelevant to the new assignment. The new unit painted its own number according to its own system, or according to no system at all, depending on who was making the decision. And that brings us to the third answer, which might be the most interesting one. The decision about what number to paint on a tank was, in many units, left almost entirely to the unit level, not to division, not to course, to regiment or brigade, or sometimes even to individual company commanders. And those commanders, dealing with combat operations, supply problems, personnel shortages, and the constant pressure of a war that was not going well, did not always prioritize standardization of tactical markings. Some units developed their own consistent schemes. You can find photographs where all the tanks in a particular unit clearly follow a logical pattern. The numbers make sense relative to each other. Someone thought about this and applied it deliberately. But in other units, the numbers seem almost random. Different fonts, different colors, different positions on the hull or turret. Some large, some small. Some on the front, some on the side, some on both. Occasionally on the rear. If you look at enough Soviet tank photographs from the Second World War, you start to realize that what you're seeing isn't a unified system with variations. You're seeing dozens of parallel systems that sometimes resemble each other and sometimes don't resemble each other at all. There's another layer to this that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, and it has to do with Soviet military culture around secrecy. The Red Army was, from the very beginning of its existence, extraordinarily secretive about its order of battle. Unit designations were considered sensitive information. Revealing the identity of a specific regiment or division in the wrong context could theoretically give the enemy intelligence about Soviet deployments, strength, and movements. This wasn't paranoia without foundation. German signals intelligence and reconnaissance were genuinely effective, and the Soviets knew it. So there was a deliberate, institutionally reinforced incentive to make the external markings on vehicles as uninformative as possible to an outside observer. A numbering system that was internally consistent within a unit, but externally meaningless to anyone who didn't already have the key, was, from a security standpoint, actually preferable to a standardized system that could be decoded if captured documents or photographs fell into enemy hands. This isn't speculation. Soviet military doctrine explicitly addressed the need to prevent enemy intelligence from reading tactical markings. Field regulations and orders from various periods of the war contain instructions about limiting the information value of external vehicle markings. The result was a kind of deliberate obscurity, baked into the system from the top down. Numbers that looked like numbers but didn't connect to anything traceable from outside the unit. A captured Soviet tank with the number 47 painted on the turret told a German intelligence officer almost nothing about which unit it came from, what formation it was part of, or where that formation was positioned. That was not an accident. Now let's talk about what the numbers did mean internally. Because even if they didn't match any central registry, they usually meant something to the people using them. Within a given unit, tactical numbers served real purposes. A company commander watching his tanks advance across a field needed to be able to distinguish Vehicle 12 from Vehicle 13 when calling in a radio instruction or giving a visual signal. Mechanics in a field workshop needed to know which tank belonged to which crew and which crew was responsible for which maintenance. Supply officers needed to track ammunition and fuel consumption against specific vehicles. None of that required connection to a central registry. It just required internal consistency within the unit. And that's what most units had: their own internal logic, their own scheme, applied by whoever was responsible for marking the vehicles, and understood by everyone in that unit, even if it was completely opaque to anyone outside it. The problem for historians is that when you're looking at a photograph taken in 1943, you have no way of knowing what unit the tank belonged to, what their internal numbering scheme was, or what the number on the turret actually meant within that scheme. You just see a number. And the number doesn't match any central registry, because no central registry ever recorded it. Let's talk about some specific examples, because the abstract explanation is one thing, but the reality of how this played out on the ground is something else entirely. Take the battle for Kursk in the summer of 1943. This was one of the largest armored engagements in history, hundreds of Soviet tanks on each side of the salient, organized into multiple fronts, armies, corps, brigades. The Soviets were better organized by this point than they had been in 1941. The command structure was more coherent. Supply lines were functioning better, and yet photographic and documentary evidence from Kursk shows an extraordinary variety of numbering schemes across different units involved in the same battle. Tanks from the 1st Tank Army look different from tanks of the 5th Guards Tank Army. Tanks within the same corps show different conventions between different brigades. Some units used 2-digit numbers, some used 3. Some painted numbers on the turret only. Some on both the turret and hull. Some numbers were outlined in a contrasting color. Some weren't, and some vehicles had no tactical numbers at all, just a plain tank going into battle with nothing on the outside that identified it beyond its type and whatever markings the factory had applied. Now multiply that across the entirety of the Eastern Front, across 4 years of fighting from Leningrad to Stalingrad to Berlin, across dozens of major formations, hundreds of brigades, thousands of individual vehicles, and you start to get a sense of the scale of the inconsistency. It wasn't an anomaly. It was the norm. The anomaly was a unit that maintained clean, consistent, well-documented tactical markings across an extended period of combat operations. Those units existed, but they were the exception. There's something else worth examining, which is the role of tank crews themselves in this story. Because the numbers on Soviet tanks weren't always decided by officers. In some units, particularly in the more chaotic periods of the war, it was the crew that painted whatever was available in whatever way they thought best. Think about what that means for a moment. You have 4 men, a commander, a gunner, a driver, and a loader. They've been given a tank, possibly one they've never sat in before. They're told they're moving out tomorrow morning, and someone hands them a brush and a can of paint and tells them to put a number on the vehicle. What number? The one the company commander assigned, if he got around to assigning them. The one from the previous vehicle, if they're replacing a tank that was just knocked out. A number that seemed to make sense relative to the other tanks they could see around them. Or sometimes just a number. Any number. Because what mattered was that the tank had something on it, and they were about to go to war, and there wasn't time to worry about whether it matched anything in a document somewhere. This wasn't universal. Plenty of Soviet units had clear procedures for assigning and painting tactical numbers, and those procedures were followed. But the existence of this more improvised approach in significant parts of the force explains a lot of the variation you see in the historical record. It also explains something that researchers studying Soviet tank markings have noticed repeatedly, which is the appearance of numbers that seem to have been changed or repainted multiple times on the same vehicle. You can see in some photographs where the ghost of an old number shows through a newer coat of paint, or where the paint style of a current number is clearly different from earlier photographs of the same vehicle. The number on a tank wasn't necessarily its permanent identity. It was whatever the unit decided it should be at any given moment, and the unit's decision could change. Let's go deeper into something that often gets overlooked in discussions of Soviet tank markings, which is the role of the repair system. The Soviet armored force had a remarkably sophisticated field repair network by the middle of the war. There were forward repair points that could fix minor damage and get a tank back in action within hours. There were brigade-level repair shops that could handle more serious damage and restore a vehicle to combat readiness within days. And there were rear-area factory facilities that could completely rebuild a destroyed or severely damaged tank from the frame up. This system was one of the significant advantages the Soviets had over the Germans in the War of Attrition that characterized the Eastern Front from 1943 onward. The Germans destroyed Soviet tanks at impressive rates, but the Soviets recovered, repaired, and returned a much higher proportion of their knocked-out vehicles than German intelligence estimates expected. A tank that was immobilized in the afternoon might be back in action 2 days later. And when it came back, it might have a different number than when it left, because it had been assigned to a different unit, or because the repair facility had repainted it under their own temporary scheme, or simply because whoever did the final finishing work before it went back to the front put on whatever number they thought was appropriate. There were also captured German tanks that entered Soviet service, and this adds yet another layer of complexity. The Soviets were pragmatic about using enemy equipment when it was available and functional. Captured Panzer Tings, Panzer IVs, and even some Panther tanks were pressed into Soviet service, particularly in the earlier years of the war. These vehicles presented an obvious problem. A German tank rolling with a Soviet unit looked like a German tank. Friendly fire was a serious risk, so captured tanks typically received prominent Soviet markings, often including large red stars and tactical numbers that identified them as friendly. But those numbers were assigned by whatever unit was using them, following whatever scheme that unit happened to use. They certainly weren't in any central registry, because no central registry anticipated the need to track captured German vehicles operating under Soviet tactical numbers. There's also the propaganda dimension of Soviet tank markings that deserves attention. From relatively early in the war, the Soviet system developed a practice of dedicating individual tanks or entire tank columns to specific causes or donors. Collective farms, factories, cities, republics, and individual Soviet citizens could donate money to fund tank production, and in return those tanks would be named or marked in recognition of the donation. You see this in photographs. Tanks with names painted on them. For the Motherland, Avenger, Collective Farm Worker, names of specific cities or regions. Names of individuals who had donated money or whose death in the war was being commemorated. These inscriptions often appeared alongside tactical numbers, which means a tank might have a unit tactical number that followed whatever scheme the unit was using, plus a name or slogan painted somewhere else on the hull that commemorated a donor or dedication. Neither the name nor the number necessarily appeared in any central document connecting them to a specific registry entry. The dedication was recorded by the propaganda organization that facilitated the donation. The tactical number was assigned by the unit. These were two parallel tracks of information that didn't necessarily intersect anywhere in the official documentation. The Guards units are worth a special mention here because they had their own marking conventions that added yet another variable to the picture. Guards designation in the Red Army was an honorific, awarded to units that had distinguished themselves in combat. Guards Tank Armies, Guards Tank Corps, Guards Tank Brigades. These units were considered elite, and they knew it. Many Guards units developed their own distinctive marking traditions that set them apart visually from regular line units. This might mean a specific color for tactical numbers, a specific placement on the vehicle, a specific style of lettering, or additional marking elements that weren't used by non-Guards formations. Some of these conventions were informal traditions that evolved within the unit. Others were more deliberately created as a matter of unit pride and identity. Either way, they added another layer of variation to the overall picture of Soviet tactical markings that a researcher trying to decode any individual photograph has to account for. Let's now talk about something specific that comes up repeatedly when historians and enthusiasts try to analyze Soviet tank photographs. The problem of the same number appearing on multiple vehicles. Because in a system where tactical numbers are assigned at the unit level, and there's no central registry coordinating assignments across units, there's nothing preventing two different tanks in two different units from having the same number. Nothing at all. Tank number 42 in one brigade is a completely different vehicle from tank number 42 in the brigade fighting 20 kilometers to its left. They can both exist simultaneously. They can both appear in photographs taken the same day. And unless the photographs also clearly show enough surrounding context to identify the unit, you can't tell them apart just from the number. This creates enormous problems for researchers trying to trace specific vehicles or to connect photographic evidence to documentary records. You find a photograph of a tank marked with the number 23, and you find a documentary reference to a tank numbered 23 involved in a specific action. Are they the same tank? Maybe, maybe not. Without additional identifying information, there's no way to know for certain. The number alone tells you very little. This problem is compounded by another characteristic of Soviet wartime photography and documentation, which is that photography in combat units was controlled and often limited. Soviet military photographers were present at the front and produced an enormous body of work over the course of the war. But photography by individual soldiers or crew members was far more restricted than in Western armies. This means the photographic record of Soviet tank markings, while substantial, has significant gaps. Units that operated in areas that attracted less press or military photographic attention left fewer visual records. Units that operated at night or in conditions of poor visibility left fewer records still. The result is that researchers are often working from a sample that may not be representative of the full range of practices in use across the Red Army at any given time. Soviet archives have opened significantly since the end of the Cold War, and researchers have been able to access documents that were completely unavailable before. Tank unit records, maintenance logs, after-action reports, operational orders. These documents have allowed historians to piece together a much more detailed picture of how Soviet armored units actually operated than was possible before. But even with this material available, the connection between documentary records and specific photographed vehicles remains difficult to establish in many cases. The numbers painted on tanks were not systematically recorded in most of the documents that have survived. A unit might record the serial numbers of tanks assigned to it, because those serial numbers were part of the official equipment accounting that higher headquarters required. But tactical numbers, the ones painted on the outside for battlefield identification, often went unrecorded in any document that found its way into an archive. There's a fascinating sub-story within this larger story that has to do specifically with tank aces. The Soviet Union recognized individual tank commanders who had exceptional combat records, and some of these men became quite well known within the military. Lavrentiy Shevchenko, Semyon Konovalov, Dmitry Lavrinenko, who is often cited as the Soviet Union's highest-scoring tank ace, credited with over 50 German vehicles destroyed before his death in December 1941. For these men, the tanks they commanded sometimes took on additional significance beyond their tactical function. The number on a vehicle associated with a known ace carried weight. Other crew members knew that number. Officers in the unit knew it. Sometimes it was photographed or mentioned in reports in ways that made it traceable even without a central registry. But this was exceptional. Most Soviet tank commanders, even very effective ones, left no such trail. They fought, they survived, or they didn't, and the number on their tank was repainted or reassigned or lost when the vehicle was destroyed or transferred without any particular documentation of what it had been. Let me walk you through what an actual day in a Soviet tank brigade's life might have looked like in terms of how these numbers actually got applied and used, because the abstract history is one thing, but the lived reality is something else. It's a morning in the summer of 1943. The brigade has received 6 new T-34s from a factory delivery the night before. The vehicles arrived with no tactical markings beyond their factory serial numbers. The brigade technical officer has a list of company and platoon assignments for these new tanks. He tells each company commander which tanks they're getting and what platoon they'll be assigned to. The company commanders, or in some cases the platoon commanders, or in some cases the mechanics in the unit workshop, decide on the tactical numbers. In a well-organized unit with a clear scheme, this is straightforward. Company 2, Platoon 1, Vehicle 2 gets the number 212, or some variation of that logic. A brush comes out, white paint or whatever color the unit uses. Someone stencils or hand paints the number onto the turret, maybe also on the hull front. Job done. The tank goes into the company's vehicle line, and tomorrow it goes into combat with a number that makes sense within the unit's system. But in a less organized unit, or a unit that's just been through a rough week and is operating under pressure, the process might be considerably more informal. Numbers get assigned on the fly. Someone paints them hastily. The style doesn't quite match the other tanks because whoever did the painting this time is a different mechanic than the one who painted the last batch. And if anyone from outside the unit photographs this tank and tries to match its number to any official document, they're going to find nothing. Because the number lives only in the tactical reality of that unit, not in any archive. Now let's move to something that deserves a substantial discussion, which is the way the numbering system evolved over the course of the war and what drove those changes. The Red Army of 1941 and the Red Army of 1945 were not the same institution. The transformation that took place between those years was one of the most significant organizational developments in the history of modern warfare. and that transformation affected tactical markings just as it affected everything else. In 1941, the Army was in crisis. Organization had collapsed in many areas. Doctrine was being rewritten in real time, in blood. The tactical numbering of vehicles was a low priority in a situation where survival itself was the overriding concern. By 1942, there was a push toward greater standardization. Soviet military doctrine was being reformed. New organizational structures, the tank corps and tank armies that would become the backbone of later Soviet armored operations, were being established with more deliberate attention to the problems of command and control that had crippled the force in 1941. Tactical markings were part of this reform effort. Documents from 1942 onward show attempts to standardize numbering schemes at the corps or army level, to specify where numbers should be placed on vehicles, what size they should be, what colors were authorized. The intention was to create at least enough consistency within major formations to make command and control of large armored operations more reliable. But intention and reality are always two different things in a war, especially one of this scale. Units that received the new instructions followed them with varying degrees of fidelity. Some applied them strictly, others applied them loosely, grafting the new scheme onto whatever they had already been doing in a way that preserved the old habits. Others ignored them almost entirely, not necessarily out of defiance, but because they were fighting and they had other things to worry about. The result is that even in the better organized later years of the war, you still find enormous variety in Soviet tactical markings. The trend was toward greater consistency, but the baseline level of variation was so high that even a significant improvement still left the overall picture extraordinarily diverse by the standards of any other major military in the conflict. One of the things that makes this topic so interesting for historians is that it's a window into something broader about the Soviet military system and Soviet institutional culture more generally. The gap between official doctrine and operational reality was a constant feature of the Red Army throughout the war, not just in tactical markings, but in 100 different areas of military practice. Official orders went out, they were acknowledged, they were technically complied with. But the way compliance actually looked on the ground was shaped by practical constraints, local decisions, individual judgment, and the relentless pressure of combat that simply didn't leave room for perfect adherence to any standard. This isn't a criticism. It's a description of how large organizations under extreme stress actually function. The remarkable thing about the Red Army is not that it failed to maintain perfect standardization across millions of men and hundreds of thousands of vehicles in one of the most brutal wars in human history. The remarkable thing is that it functioned at all, and that it went from the catastrophe of 1941 to the victory of 1945. Whatever the numbers on the tanks meant or didn't mean, those tanks got to Berlin. There's a particular photograph that I want you to think about, even if you haven't seen it specifically, because it captures something important about everything we've been discussing. It's a photograph of a column of T-34 tanks moving through a village somewhere in the Soviet Union, probably 1943 or 1944. The tanks are moving in sequence, and you can see the numbers painted on their turrets. The first tank has a number in the 20s, painted in white, fairly large, clear lettering. The second tank has a number in the 40s, painted in a slightly different style, smaller. The third tank appears to have no tactical number at all, or if it does, it's on a part of the vehicle not visible from this angle. The fourth tank has a number that appears to be in the 70s, painted in a completely different position than the first two. None of these numbers are in sequence with each other. None of them follow the pattern that the official numbering doctrine described, and yet this is a real combat unit, moving through a real village, on its way to or from a real battle. The numbers meant something to the people in those tanks. They just didn't mean what you'd expect them to mean if you were looking for a logical external system. That photograph, that column, that absence of any clear pattern, that's the reality of Soviet tank tactical markings. It's not the exception. It's the rule, and understanding that it's the rule changes how you think about all of it. Because once you stop looking for a unified system and start looking at what individual units actually did and why, the picture becomes enormously richer and more interesting. You start seeing the decisions embedded in those numbers. The unit that decided to use a 3-digit system where the first digit was the company and someone actually enforced that consistently across a 6-month period. That tells you something about that unit's culture, its leadership, its stability. The unit where the numbers are clearly improvised, clearly painted by different hands at different times, where no two tanks look quite alike. That tells you something too, about the pressure that unit was under, about the losses it had taken and replaced, about the conditions under which it was operating. The Germans who faced these tanks and tried to analyze them were often frustrated by exactly this quality. German intelligence reports from the Eastern Front occasionally reference the difficulty of drawing conclusions about Soviet unit strength or composition from external vehicle markings. A German armored reconnaissance unit might observe a group of Soviet tanks, note their numbers, and try to connect those numbers to known Soviet formations. In most cases, they couldn't. The numbers were real, but they were essentially opaque from the outside. They revealed nothing about which regiment or brigade the tank belonged to, nothing about where that formation was deployed more broadly, nothing about its strength or history. The opacity that was sometimes a byproduct of Soviet disorganization was also, functionally, a form of security through obscurity. Now let's talk about something that tends to surprise people when they first learn about it, which is how different the marking conventions were across different types of Soviet armored vehicles. We've been talking mostly about tanks, primarily T-34s and the heavier KV and IS series vehicles. But the Soviet armored force also operated substantial numbers of other vehicles: self-propelled guns, armored cars, light tanks, and large numbers of Lend-Lease vehicles from the United States and Britain. Each of these categories had its own relationship to tactical numbering. Self-propelled guns, vehicles like the Su-85, the Su-100, the ISU-122, and the ISU-152 were organized into separate formations from tank units. Their tactical numbering schemes reflected their own unit organization, which was different from tank brigade or tank corps structure. So the numbers on an Su-122 in a self-propelled artillery regiment followed whatever convention that regiment used, which might be completely different from what a T-34 in a nearby tank brigade was doing. Lend-Lease vehicles added yet another wrinkle. The United States sent thousands of M4 Sherman tanks, M3 Lee tanks, and various half-tracks and armored cars to the Soviet Union. The British sent Valentine and Matilda tanks. These vehicles arrived with their own factory markings and sometimes with British or American tactical numbers already applied. Soviet units receiving these vehicles would paint over whatever foreign markings existed and apply their own system. But the vehicles themselves, with their distinctive shapes and dimensions, created practical challenges for marking. A Sherman tank doesn't have the same turret geometry as a T-34, and the places where a Soviet unit habitually painted its numbers on T-34s might not transfer cleanly to a Sherman, so you see adaptation. Numbers painted in different locations, in different sizes, adjusted to fit the available surface on an unfamiliar vehicle type. There are also the cases of vehicles that went through multiple owners. A tank might start as a factory-fresh T-34, delivered to a unit in 1942, and given that unit's number. It gets damaged, sent back for repair, and while at the rear, the unit it belonged to is destroyed and reconstituted under a new designation. The repaired tank goes back to the front, assigned now to this nominally successor unit, and gets repainted with a new number under whatever scheme the new unit uses. Then it gets damaged again, this time severely enough to go to a factory for complete rebuild. It comes out essentially a new vehicle mechanically, goes to a third unit, gets a third number. At any point in this journey, a photograph of this tank shows a number that has no connection to any central registry, because the tank's history has crossed through 3 different unit systems, none of which were coordinated with each other or with any central tracking mechanism. It's worth spending some time on what Soviet veterans themselves remembered about this system, because the human dimension of it is something the documentary and photographic record doesn't fully capture. Veterans who served in tank crews during the war gave interviews and wrote memoirs in the post-war decades, and some of their accounts touch on the question of how numbers were assigned and what they meant to the crews. What comes through in many of these accounts is that the crew's attachment was to the vehicle itself rather than to its number. If you survived your tank being knocked out and you were assigned to a new vehicle, that new vehicle got a new number, and you started fresh. The number was almost incidental. What mattered was the machine and the men inside it. Some crews did develop attachments to specific numbers, particularly if the unit had a tradition, or if the number was one that had been carried by a vehicle associated with a specific success or survival. But this was sentiment rather than system. The number on a tank in the Red Army was, in the deepest sense, just a label applied for immediate operational convenience. It wasn't a serial number in the Western sense. It wasn't a permanent identity that traveled with the vehicle through its life. It was a tool for the moment. There's also the physical reality of maintaining markings in the field to consider. Paint degrades, particularly on a vehicle that is constantly operating in extreme conditions, getting hit by shell fragments, covered in mud, exposed to extreme temperatures, driven through water obstacles, repaired repeatedly in the field. A number painted in the spring might be barely visible by the summer after a sustained operation. Units that were moving constantly, fighting regularly, and maintaining their vehicles under difficult conditions often had markings that were visibly worn or faded in photographs. When numbers were repainted, they weren't always repainted in exactly the same way. The color might be slightly different because a different paint was used. The size might be different because a different stencil was available. The position might shift slightly. All of this variation was captured by wartime photographers without any context that would allow a later researcher to determine which variation was significant and which was just the result of repainting with whatever was on hand. Let's talk about the role of unit identity in all of this, because it goes beyond just operational necessity. Soviet tank units, like combat units in every army, developed strong internal cultures, traditions, symbols, shared experiences that bound the members of the unit together and distinguished them from other formations. Tactical markings could be part of this culture. The specific color a unit used for its numbers, the style of the lettering, the particular position on the turret, these could become markers of unit identity as much as operational tools. When a unit repainted damaged markings, it might be scrupulous about maintaining the exact style it had established, not because any regulation required it, but because that style had become part of who they were. A tank from the 3rd Guards Tank Brigade looked a certain way, and that look, maintained even under difficult conditions, was a source of pride. This is another reason why looking at Soviet tactical markings purely through the lens of official doctrine misses so much of what was actually going on. The markings weren't just official identifiers. They were also expressions of unit identity, applied and maintained by human beings who cared about their unit and wanted to express that care, even in something as mundane as the color and style of a painted number. There's a specific case that illustrates many of these dynamics with particular clarity, and that's the way the numbering system changed within individual units after major battles. After a battle that had cost a unit heavily, the surviving vehicles and the replacement vehicles brought in to restore the unit to strength often didn't immediately synchronize their numbering. Survivors kept their existing numbers. New vehicles got new numbers assigned under whatever was available. The result was often a period of numerical chaos within the unit, where the numbers present didn't follow any consistent scheme, and where the internal logic that had existed before the battle had to be rebuilt from scratch. Units with strong technical leadership and good organizational discipline rebuilt their numbering schemes quickly and consistently. Units that were thrown back into combat before they could reorganize simply went forward with whatever numbers were on the vehicles, consistent or not. After enough cycles of this, the cumulative effect was a numbering history for many vehicles that was essentially unknowable without access to the unit's own internal records, which in many cases didn't survive the war. The study of Soviet tank markings has actually become a serious academic and military history discipline in its own right over the past few decades. Researchers who work in this area, many of them working from Soviet archives that opened after 1991, have made significant progress in establishing what the actual practices were across different units, fronts, and periods of the war. But even with all this work, the honest conclusion is that the full picture remains incomplete, and probably always will be. Too many records were destroyed, too many practices were informal, too many decisions were made at a level below what got written down and preserved. What we have is a rich and fascinating partial picture that tells us an enormous amount about how the Red Army actually worked, as opposed to how it was supposed to work. And that gap between the official version and the operational reality is itself one of the most interesting things about studying it. For people who build scale models of Soviet tanks or paint miniatures for war games, this creates a situation that is simultaneously liberating and bewildering. The liberating part is that there's almost no wrong answer when you're applying tactical markings to a Soviet tank from World War II, at least not in the sense of being definitively contradicted by the historical record. The variety in the original is so enormous that almost any number in almost any style, in almost any position, can be justified by pointing to a real example somewhere in the photographic or documentary record. The bewildering part is that if you want to be accurate to a specific unit or a specific vehicle, you need to do a serious amount of research, And even then, you may find that the evidence is ambiguous or contradictory. The numbers on Soviet tanks were real. They were applied by real people for real reasons. But they don't submit easily to the kind of systematic analysis that other military marking systems support. Here's what all of this ultimately tells us. When you look at those numbers on Soviet tanks in old photographs, you're looking at something that was never meant to be decoded by anyone outside the unit. You're looking at improvised solutions to real operational problems, applied under conditions of extreme stress, by people who had other things to worry about than whether their marking system would make sense to historians 70 years later. Some of those numbers were carefully assigned according to a well-maintained internal scheme. Some were painted in a rush by a mechanic who had been told to put something on the vehicle before dawn. Some were repainted 3 times on the same vehicle as it passed through different units in different hands. Some carried the ghost of a previous number underneath them. Some followed official doctrine closely. Some ignored official doctrine entirely. All of them were real. All of them meant something to someone, and almost none of them had any connection to a central official registry. Because the Red Army, for all its enormous scale and eventual effectiveness, operated in a way that simply didn't produce or maintain that kind of centralized documentation of tactical markings. The system that existed was human, improvised, practical, and opaque from the outside, by design and by necessity. One more dimension worth examining before we close this out, and it's one that ties everything together in an unexpected way. The fact that Soviet tactical numbers were so inconsistent and so poorly documented actually had a paradoxical effect on post-war historical understanding of what Soviet tanks were capable of and how Soviet armored units actually fought. Because without reliable vehicle-level tracking, it's genuinely difficult to assess things like individual tank kill ratios, crew survival rates, vehicle reliability figures, and unit effectiveness over time, in the same way that these metrics can be studied for some other forces. The German tank force, for all the chaos of the later war years, maintained better vehicle-level records that have survived and been analyzed in considerable detail. The Soviet force, partly because of the numbering situation we've been discussing, and partly because of other aspects of their documentation culture, left a record that is harder to mine for this kind of granular data. This has contributed to debates that still continue among military historians about exactly how effective the Soviet armored force was at different stages of the war, and what the real losses and kill ratios looked like on both sides of major engagements. The numbers painted on the tanks, or rather the absence of any central registry connecting those numbers to anything else, are one reason why those debates remain open. There's also something philosophically interesting in all of this about the nature of large organizations under stress. Every bureaucratic system imagines itself as more complete, more coherent, and more rational than it actually is. The official records of any military describe a force that is organized, tracked, documented, and controlled. The reality on the ground is always messier than the official picture. With Soviet tactical tank mark,